Afternoon, evening, everybody. My name is Elham Yusufian. I work for the International Disability Alliance as the Inclusive Humanitarian Action Senior Advisor. And one of the projects that I work on is on rights of refugees and displaced persons with disabilities. Thank you so much for joining us today. This webinar is one of the series of webinars we are organizing under the collaboration with the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. Today we are going to discuss human rights mechanisms and how they can be used to advance rights of refugees with disabilities. Before we start, I will ask my colleague Tanya to give you a briefing about logistics and how you can make sure that you can access this webinar. We have a lot of accessibility features, so Tanya will walk you through all of them. Tanya, thank you so much. Over to you.
Dear all, my name is Tanya, and I'm going to briefly explain you some of the technical features of today's call. This webinar is being recorded. There is international sign interpretation, captioning in English, and language interpretation in French, Spanish, and French language. A CC button on the bottom of your screen in the meeting controls toolbar will enable the closed captions. If you need captions in the external window, I will share a link in the chat box. The interpretation button on the bottom of your screen, presented as a globe, will allow you to access specific language channel. Please choose your channel that will follow throughout the meeting. The participants do not have an option of opening the microphone and video. Should you have questions, kindly leave them in Q&A section. Our team is monitoring the chat box and will try and respond to questions during the event where is possible. Should you have any accessibility issues, please send a private message to the host account or email webinars@idasecretariat.org. We request all speakers to kindly keep to times and keep their cameras if not speaking. We are asking you that you speak slow enough for the interpreters and captioners to follow. Thank you all and have a good webinar.
Thank you, Tanya. This is Ricardo speaking. I work with Elham, but from the UN Refugee Agency. My title is a Protection Officer on Disability Inclusion. And we have organized this series of webinars as a way of closing the second year of our collaboration between the International Disability Alliance and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. There are many areas of work that we've been exploring this year, from a discussion in how the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and refugee law interact, and you will be having an opportunity to join a webinar on this in 2 weeks, as well preparing for the next Global Refugee Forum, which will take in a year, more or less from now, at the end of 2023. There will be a webinar as well. And we have been as well discussing and exchanging in these 2 last years on supporting coordination and engagement with human rights mechanisms. As you know, these type of mechanisms provide an avenue for all of us, UN entities, organizations of persons with disabilities, NGOs, to monitor the compliance of member states with human rights and with their commitments under different treaty bodies. Today, we are going to explore how it is possible to bring to light issues related to persons with disabilities who are refugees, who are stateless, and others who are the joint mandate that we have between UN Refugee Agency and the International Disability Alliance. We will hear experiences and advice from 2 key experts. The first one is Juan Ignacio Perez from the treaty body units. Tanya, would you like to, sorry, I saw your hand raised. Is okay?
I'm sorry, it's a mistake,
Go,
sorry.
please. Okay, no worries. So we will hear from Juan Ignacio Perez first from the treaty body units in the International Disability Alliance, followed by our colleague Peter Svirniaski from the Human Rights Liaison Unit. We aim at having 15 minutes approximately introductions on the work of both agencies, and then the idea is to have an open discussion, questions and answers. If you have ideas, interests on how to get more engaged in coordination with human rights mechanisms. So Juan Ignacio, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for passing me the floor. And thank you, of course, to my colleagues within the International Disability Alliance and to the colleagues from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees for organizing this event. Very pleased to be part of it. I work as human rights advisor on treaty wise for International Disability Alliance, and my main role is to support national organizations of persons with disabilities and other civil society stakeholders in participating before United Nations treaty bodies, and then also to develop written submissions and doing advocacy on behalf of the Alliance itself in general thematic processes carried out by the United Nations treaty bodies, on which we will be discussing a little. In these minutes that come, I'd like to share the screen and present a PowerPoint presentation. I would just need to have an okay that this is working, if anybody can confirm. Thank you very much. So on this PowerPoint presentation, we will be discussing briefly, of course, the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the role of other UN treaty bodies in terms of including issues connected to refugees with disabilities, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons with disabilities, and stateless persons with disabilities. And then we will briefly refer to the processes of individual communication and by United Nations treaty bodies. And fourthly and finally, a brief reference to the two very important mandates under the Human Rights Council, which are Special Rapporteurs on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and Special Rapporteur on Internally Displaced Persons. I move forward. This might sound familiar to many of you. I see within the participant list names that of people that have collaborated in the past around these processes. So I'm sorry for being repetitive on that front. The CAPD committee, of course, you all know, or you might know, it's composed by 18 independent members, held 27 sessions until now, and has reviewed 113 countries so far, and of course has done other things as well. I will skip some details to move quickly and only focusing on important, but I will be happy to share the PowerPoint so that you have all the information that is presented there. I move forward. Of course, now the screen just shows a picture of the CAPD committee and highlights that they are elected with consideration of equitable geographical distribution, representation of legal systems, gender balance, and participation of experts with disabilities, who we can see in the picture. The CAPD committee, and in this similar to other human rights committees that we will be mentioning later, has four main functions, which are undertaking state reviews of the implementation by states of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and then the function of processing and analyzing individual complaints, other function of undertaking inquiries when receiving information on systematic violations of human rights of persons with disabilities in a given context, and also the function of adopting general comments which clarify and elaborate on the content of the convention on different topics. For instance, the recently adopted general comment number 8 on the right to employment under Article 27. The more interesting function for us at this event is, of course, the state reviews. In the screen now, we project the typical diagram of the review cycle, in which the CAPD committee, based on an exchange of questions and reports with state parties, produces a list of recommendations to the states. This happens, or this is meant to happen periodically. We will now go into the very much detail of the different steps, but it's very important for us to know that organizations of persons with disabilities and other civil society organizations have the opportunity to input the process through alternative reports, written and more focused written submissions, which might be comprehensive, tackling all the points of the convention, or might be thematic specific at the different stages of the process. Needless to say as well that there are also opportunities to meet face-to-face in private meetings with committee members, and the pandemic and the fact that now we all work more easily online has actually created new opportunities for remote participation and exchanges with members of the CAPD committee. On this, I just want to do an important comment, which is that, of course, most of the organizations that participate in the reviews of the different states throughout the process are usually national organizations of persons with disabilities, and at the core of the process, and eventually other national civil society organizations. What I have noticed throughout the years is that it's not that often that national organizations include issues connected to refugees with disabilities or internally displaced persons with disabilities, asylum seekers, and stateless persons, and even migrants with disabilities. And this has to do with the fact that it's not necessarily among the main issues of their own concern. So it's great to have this activity, and it's great that among your colleagues we can promote also the participation of these other groups of persons with disabilities, whether it is in coordination with other organizations, whether it is even through additional submissions to the CAPD committee, or we will see other UN treaty bodies that we will mention later. So throughout the process, the important thing is that from the very beginning, if possible, organizations of persons with disabilities and allies and participants bring their issues and influence and lobby committee members so that their issues that they bring and the questions that they bring are reflected throughout the different documents and the different opportunities that the process provides. You might all have heard about a list of issues in which a committee asks questions to the states. You might all have heard about constructive dialogues, which include a session of 6 hours between the CAPD committee and the state delegation, which is webcasted online. And of course, the more important, the concluding observations in which the committee includes the recommendations. Here I will pass this. There are three slides that relate to the very technical requirements of the written submissions that organizations, national organizations and other stakeholders can do. And this will be of very much detail at this point, but it's important that you keep it and then you review it. Of course, in terms of word limits, deadlines, sources, typical sources to use, etc. Going into the substance, meaning the issues connected to the groups addressed by this webinar, we can say that the CPD committee has very well tackled the situation of asylum seekers, refugees, internally displaced persons, and statelessness persons with disabilities, mainly under Article 11 of the CPD on situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies. But of course, this is not the only place that we can find. We can also find Article 18 on freedom of movement and nationality, which refers to the situation of migrants with disabilities generally. Of course, not entering into the at this point on the specific definitions of each of the groups. Simply to say that we should also take a glimpse at the recommendations the committee did under Article 18 and also other articles. This is to say that, of course, if the committee receives at the different reviews information on these groups under these articles, the committee will continue to include recommendations for their benefit. I move forward. Here now the screen is projecting the text of Article 11 of the CPD that most of you probably are familiar with. Basically requiring states to take all necessary measures to ensure the protection and safety of persons with disabilities in situation of risk, including armed conflict, humanitarian emergencies, and natural disasters. I move forward, and then we can see some examples of recommendations, even very recent ones, in which the CPD committee includes asylum seekers, refugees, and stateless persons. For instance, here to Indonesia, the committee recommending the state to recognize that the law on disability also applies to asylum seekers, refugees, and stateless persons with disabilities to enable their access to education, health system, other social services. This is something which is not typically done by the national disability laws, and here the CPD committee comes to require it. Like that, we can find other cases, and we can do a review of the jurisprudence of the CPD committee. IDA has recently updated the compilation of concluding observations of the CPD committee, so this information can be downloaded in IDA website, so that we can move a little bit forward and skip these other examples on Myanmar and on Kenya to move, for the sake of time, to other treaty bodies. Here, while I advance, I also noted recommendations under Article 18, for instance, recently on Bangladesh, on India, and then under the articles, for instance, on social protection, which is quite an issue for migrants and refugees with disabilities at the state of destination, and on right to health on Iraq. We move forward for the sake of time. Of course, confidentiality when reporting is something that can be protected, so eventually we can discuss that. I project here in this slide the countries that are coming for review. The more immediate ones: Angola, Argentina, Georgia, Peru, Togo, Tunisia, Honduras, Kiribati, Lithuania, Mali, Palestine, and Dominican Republic next March, at different stages of the process, but all of those countries towards next March. We move forward. And here I just want to share that, of course, other UN treaty bodies have similar systems to review states' compliance with their conventions. And this includes the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Human Rights Committee, Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Committee on the Rights of the Child, and of course, Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers. We have found, preparing for this presentation, that these committees have also tackled directly and recently the situation of internally displaced persons, not necessarily explicitly in connection with disability, but we know that these committees, for instance, now in the screen, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, this, if one takes information connected to persons with disabilities, they will be happy to take it on board, as they usually do whenever they receive the information. Same thing for the Committee on the Rights of the Child. Here projecting a recommendation on South Sudan from 2022. And the same for the Committee on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which now counts with the presence of a member with disability that most of us know, which is Ms. Ana Peláez. And very importantly, this committee in 2014 adopted its general recommendation on the gender-related dimension of refugee status, asylum, nationality, and statelessness of women. It also has a general recommendation on disabled women, which might need to get updated. But the point is here, again, information would be very much welcomed by this committee, with the caveat that there needs to be some gender dimension to it, which is not always obvious when we present the information. IDA is part of a coalition called the TVNet, where we publish in a consolidated document all the upcoming reviews, and this document is updated following the update of the many website pages of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in case you would like to see if your country is coming for any review of treaty bodies. I mean, your country or the country in which you are currently based, basically. I mean, I realize I ran out of time, but I will just, if colleagues in the organization allow to let me go for 4 to 5 more minutes, that would be great. Just to give, if not.
Yes, no
yes?
problem, Juan. Go ahead.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as the other many UN treaty bodies, all of them, or most of them, have functions that derive from optional protocols to those conventions. And one of those is, as we had said, to receive individual complaints from people affected by the states. This, that we typically call individual communications, are, of course, this mechanism is only available for the states that ratify the optional protocol of the treaty that we might be discussing. For instance, if it is about refugee children, we might want to seek we might want to approach the Committee on the Rights of the Child, but we need to double check that the state that we are accusing of a human rights violation has ratified this optional protocol. We move forward. It's important to know that this possibility represents a subsidiary protection of rights. That means that before trying to use these mechanisms, we need to as we usually say quite technically, exhaust domestic remedies, which means try to address or tackle the problem at the judiciary of the country that we might be talking about. There might be a few exceptions that can be actually very useful, even if one presents this requirement very strongly because it's important. The exceptions might open doors that we might imagine absolutely closed. One important point is the possibility to request, when submitting a complaint, the possibility to request interim measures so that the different committees immediately react and request the state to stop or to do something to avoid possible irreparable damage to the victim or victims of the alleged violation. This is a little bit hidden, if you like, from the general public of human rights advocates, but this can be actually very important, especially in the context of that we are discussing. And I will show quickly one case in which this has had an impact, as an example. Of course, I add the link to the OHCHR website if needed. Here, what I project now is one decision, by the CRPD committee has a couple of views on individual communications related to asylum seekers in most of them are in Sweden, actually. Seemingly there is a disability law NGO or something utilizing this optional protocol, but in which the committee has considered the issue of asylum seekers with disabilities. Most of the time, the cases are about preventing the deportation of the asylum seeker to the country of origin because of something connected to their disability. For instance, the lack of appropriate health care or the lack of appropriate services for autistic persons, as I believe is this current case, which is from 2017. In the next slide, there is another case similar by the CPD committee, so I just skip now. And here we have a case. This is not connected to persons with disabilities per se, but connected to children who were asylum seekers. And here we could see a very positive impact of a simple request of an interim measure when the applicants or the people bringing the case to the Committee on the Rights of the Child highlighted. I will move now. There are other cases of other committees that I would invite you to double check in the PowerPoint, and simply here to mention the other two things I wanted to mention, which are the existence and work of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Mr. J.R. Quinn, which has recently adopted two relevant reports for this theme. And importantly, who can also receive information and send communication to states to express concerns and request the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities. And we have a recent communication in connection to the situation of children with disabilities internally displaced and institutionalized in Ukraine in the current context there. And finally, we have the Special Rapporteur on internally displaced persons with similar competencies and similar tasks to do, including, I didn't mention before, including country visits when states agree, and also the possibility to receive information directly and engage in communications with the state parties. One very important point for these two special rapporteurs is that they can work in connection to any UN member state, and it doesn't matter whether they ratified or not any human rights treaty. So sorry, I might have gone a little bit beyond time and speaking a little bit fast, but I think I hope this was useful and clear for colleagues. I'm happy to take any questions and of course to share this PowerPoint presentation for people to be able to explore it more calmly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Ignacio. This is Ricardo speaking. There were two questions in the Q&A box, but about accessing recordings and materials. We will share the recording and materials that are relevant, including links, etc., with all people having registered to the webinar. So no worries. If you have any other question, please type it in there. I recommend as well for you to follow the link for captioning, because I think we have a problem with the captioning, the automatic captioning embedded, so it doesn't work well. But the link on external captioning works well. Thank you. I'm passing now the floor. If you could please stop sharing, Juan Ignacio, and I will share the screen for our next colleague, Peter, from the Human Rights Liaison Unit in UNHCR. Over to you, Peter.
Sorry, but you're muted.
Peter.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, this is Peter Snarski. I'm a legal officer in UNHCR's, what we call our Human Rights Liaison Unit. I'm very pleased to follow Juan Ignacio because he gave a great overview of the mechanisms, and that will allow me to be a lot more succinct and just talk a little bit from UNHCR's experience, how we found engaging with the CRPD in particular, but also other UN human rights mechanisms useful for our work. I have on the screen two documents, which I will put links to in the chat box. One is UNHCR's Human Rights Engagement Strategy that talks about our overall approach to using human rights engagement to support our work. And the second one is a compilation of good practices, so cases where UNHCR has seen the effects, the positive impacts on the ground of working with UN mechanisms like the CRPD. So I'll put those two resources in the chat box for colleagues, and they can also be shared afterwards with anyone interested. To talk a little bit about our units, our role, and why we engage with mechanisms like the CRPD. We're based here in Geneva, and we have a liaison function with the mechanisms like the CRPD operating here in Geneva, as well as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who works as the secretary for those mechanisms. And our role within our own organization is to help colleagues in the field find ways to enhance the protection of persons of concern. When I say persons of concern, I mean our displaced and stateless populations that we're trying to serve. And as part of that mandate, we need to see and ensure that they have protection in the field. And with protection, we're meaning they can exercise their fundamental rights, including the rights of displaced and stateless persons with disabilities under the CRPD or any of the other human rights treaties. We see using these mechanisms as a way to complement our advocacy that we do under our mandate under the Refugee Convention and the Statelessness Conventions, finding other partners and actors that we can work with to strengthen our positions. And this includes, of course, organizations of persons with disabilities, but also perhaps state stakeholders, other NGOs and actors at the country level who we might not otherwise interact with if we were looking at things directly from a refugee law only perspective. So bringing in the human rights, the perspective and using these human rights mechanisms allows us to also reach out to broader stakeholders, national human rights institutions as well, for example. They also are a useful tool for us because, as Juan Ignacio mentioned, there's oftentimes channels to engage confidentially with some of these mechanisms. So it can allow us to highlight some of the human rights challenges that persons with disabilities among our populations are facing, even when the context is potentially sensitive and we're facing pressure from government counterparts or others to not speak about certain human rights issues. We can sometimes channel that information through the CRPD, through some of the special rapporteurs that Juan Ignacio mentioned to highlight those issues and make sure that they're getting the attention that they deserve, even if we have to focus our own advocacy with the government on the pragmatic issues and not so much using that human rights language. So they provide us a lot of useful ways to complement our work and also to use existing work. And I think the same goes for organizations of persons with disabilities. There's a lot of work happening at the field level, a lot of information being collected about human rights challenges, issues, and abuses, and that information can be used and re-leveraged in a sense through some of these mechanisms to be able to give it further value and attention at the international level, in addition to the work that's being done at national level. So if you go to the next slide, Ricardo, I'll talk a little bit about the CRPD in particular, because that's one of the focuses today. We've been looking back at our engagement with the CRPD over the last few years. It's one of the newer treaty bodies, and it's one that we've been continuing to grow our engagement with. But we've seen that in addition to our work on Article 11, as Ricardo mentioned, as Juan Ignacio mentioned, relating to situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies, our colleagues in the field have been raising a number of issues across the board with the CRPD, from Article 9 on accessibility issues to Article 4 relating to just core general obligations. Of course, looking at issues of equality and non-discrimination, access to health services, even issues of exploitation, violence and abuse, and access to education. These are just some of the articles that we've been seeing time and time again. Our operations in the field are highlighting to the committee, and we've been seeing a really high rate of reflection of those recommendations in the outcomes that are coming from the committee. And these provide very useful advocacy tools for our colleagues in the field. So we're really trying to continue to build on this progress that we're making, these outcomes that we're getting from the committee, and encourage more of our operations to work with our displaced and stateless persons with disabilities, work with local organizations of persons with disabilities to find the information that they need to advocate through the CRPD. And I think an important thing also that we want to encourage, and we're continuing to encourage, is the follow-up and outcomes that we can then achieve once we have useful recommendations from these mechanisms. And on that, I'll mention one or two examples of our engagement. You can also find them in the Good Practice Guide if you want to look at them in a bit more detail. But when I say we're seeing positive outcomes for the people that we're working with in the field, I'll mention one case where UNHCR engaged confidentially with the CRPD, and we saw in our operation in the field that the refugee law had guaranteed the rights of refugees to receive equal treatment as nationals within the state's social programs and assistance services. However, our operation realized in practice by working with our affected populations that refugees, asylum seekers, and some of the other populations that we worked with weren't being given access to disability support schemes in particular. So that particular piece of legislation was not being covered by the refugee law, and people were not able to access everything from wheelchairs to mobility aids and any other number of services that the state was providing to nationals. Even though we couldn't unlock progress on this issue through our traditional advocacy, which is we work with our government partners to advocate for changes, when we saw that wasn't working, we took advantage of the reviews of the CRPD. We raised concerns about these issues to the committee, and they in turn issued recommendations aligned with those concerns to the state. And in this case, it doesn't always work, but in this case, the state then received those recommendations and said, okay, UNHCR, we're now happy to sit down and talk about how we can adjust the refugee law in order to ensure that we're properly incorporating these populations that you're working with, and ensuring that those persons with disabilities are also included in those protection schemes. So it's a step-by-step process. The first step was we've now been able to include refugees in the national systems, and we're continuing to advocate step by step to also hopefully include asylum seekers and other persons that we work with within the same system. So this is just one very concrete example of the traditional type of advocacy that we're trying to do through the CRPD. Unlock progress on some of these sticky issues where we're not able to achieve those outcomes through our just traditional advocacy with state interlocutors. Another example, and this is going more broadly to our collaboration and participation with the CRPD, but we've also tried to have high-level participation in the conference of the state parties. So the state parties to this treaty come together every so often to discuss the implementation of the treaty and other related issues. So we've had our Assistant High Commissioner participate in one of those meetings. Ricardo and other colleagues have also participated in annual meetings of the CRPD, also to sensitize and raise awareness about general trends and issues that we're seeing when it comes to displaced and stateless persons with disabilities. And this helps, I think, broadly across all of the work that the committee is doing, including its general recommendations, its general comments, the general guidance that it's providing, such as the recent guidance on deinstitutionalization, helping to ensure that the guidance that they're producing also includes reference to displaced and stateless persons with disabilities, so that when states think about their implementation, that they have these trigger points to also remember and think about how the particular situation of displacement and statelessness might factor into the protections that they need to provide. So if you just go one more slide, Ricardo, I won't take too much more time because I just want to mention a few more things. One being, we've been developing some guidance for our colleagues in the fields to further make clear to them and help them quickly identify where certain articles could have an aspect to them that's relevant for displaced and stateless persons with disabilities in particular. I don't share it here today. Today, I just have a few examples on the screen of 2 articles that we have done this for example, accessibility, Article 9, and equality and non-discrimination, Article 4. We've gone through and we've identified some questions that operations in the field can think about and see whether the obligations under those articles are being met with respect to displaced and stateless persons. So we're happy to share that with those that might wish to reach out to us after the webinar, but we're hoping that that also can spark some further thinking among our staff about where the rights of displaced and stateless persons with disabilities can be highlighted, both with the CRPD, but also, as Juan Ignacio mentioned, through some of the other treaty bodies, which, as he rightly said, are very interested and welcome to hear information from UNHCR and from organizations for persons with disabilities, where there's issues of intersectionality in particular with their mandates. We do work on individual cases as well. We haven't done so on a regular basis with the CRPD, but I was very pleased to see the example shared on Sweden. I think that's something that we also hope to encourage for those operations where there's the opportunity to use the individual cases through the treaty bodies, that we can do that more, particularly for displaced and stateless persons with disabilities. And we also want to continue working with the special rapporteurs and special procedures, which we do. I think there's a lot of opportunity around those country visits that Juan Ignacio mentioned for us to find synergies and to collaborate with organizations of persons with disabilities to channel information to those rapporteurs in advance of those visits, during those visits, so they meet with people that are not only in the national citizens with disabilities, but also those who might be in refugee camps or other types of settlements that are within the country where people with disabilities could also be found, making sure that those rapporteurs, when they go to a situation, can see that full spectrum of issues that are occurring. So I just wanted to share those examples with you, express a little bit why UNHCR engages with the CRPD, with organizations for persons with disabilities on the ground, and with special rapporteurs, and the opportunities that we see there. Of course, I'm not an expert on disability rights, but on, as I said, using these mechanisms and leveraging them. And I just want to emphasize that we do find it to be, as UNHCR, a really effective tool, and we encourage you to reach out to us at the national level or global level if you want to explore ways that we can work together to use these mechanisms to advance the protection of displaced and stateless persons with disabilities. So I'll perhaps stop there and give the floor back to you, Ricardo. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. This is Ricardo speaking. I hope it was very useful for all participants to have an overview of how these mechanisms, human rights mechanisms, can be used as well to channel information on human rights violations or situations of non-compliance with the CRPD and other treaties that affect refugees, stateless persons, internally displaced persons with disabilities. Many times we receive answers back from both colleagues working in development settings or colleagues working in organizations of persons with disabilities, NGOs, on a lack of engagement in refugee stateless issues, saying no, as assuming that this type of engagement should happen only through international cooperation, should happen only in situations of crisis or emergencies. So as Juan Ignacio was mentioning in relation to Article 11, and as I often say more informally, there is no context where there's no refugees. There's only context where refugees, and in particular refugees with disabilities, are made invisible in our work. So it is relevant in every country of the world, and it's our responsibility to give space to those areas. Having said that, we are going to open the floor for questions. There are already some questions that I will be reading. And Juan Ignacio and Peter, if you would like to take turns to answer, or if they refer to a specific area that you mentioned, then I will assign to you. From Juan Cobeñas, I think we have one to a process mentioned by Juan Ignacio on mentioning a 6-hour session after the presentation of a national report, and if these 6 hours were for organizations or government representatives. I think, Juan Ignacio, if you can clarify this.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and thank you very much, Juan, for the question. Nice to see you among the participants here. So I mean, I can reply actually advancing to you the information on Argentina for next March. Basically, the 6 hours session is a session with the state delegation. It's a dialogue between the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the state delegation, in which the committee asks questions. Of course, there is a formal moment in which the state delegation presents the reports and achievements on the rights of persons with disabilities, etc. And then there are 3 clusters of questions going through every single article of the convention. Next March for Argentina, if I'm not mistaken, that will happen on March 15 from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. and from and the following day from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. For organizations of persons with disabilities, there is a formal opportunity, which is called a private briefing with the CRPD committee, usually lasting 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. I didn't want to go into that detail in the initial presentation. And this is usually in the beginning of the week in which the state is reviewed. For the case of Argentina next year, it will be on Monday, 13th of March, in the morning of Geneva time. Yes, that to reply. Besides that, from the International Disability Alliance, we try to facilitate as many interactions between organizations of persons with disabilities and committee members as possible, which is also easier now that everybody uses Zoom or whatever, any other software for communication. I think that answers the question. Thanks, Ricardo.
Thank you, Juan Ignacio, and Juan was thanking you in the chat. I'll go for the next one from Musa Chafardin, and is from Friends of Disabled Association Lebanon. I'm wondering, how can we secure the rights of refugee and displaced persons with disabilities if the hosting countries are not able to respond to the needs? And I assume that would be for their own nationals or including refugee and displaced persons. I noticed that the question is, it has more of an operational aspect to it, right? Maybe it would be interesting if Juan Ignacio and Peter could answer from a perspective of engaging with human rights mechanisms. What are the areas that can be raised to the committee or the different committees, so these rights can be secured? So what are the opportunities from a human rights perspective and less from an operational perspective? Over to you. Maybe Peter, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you, Ricardo, and thanks for the question, Musa. And I think it's a relevant question in a lot of contexts where it's just clear that the resources aren't necessarily there to provide all the services that are needed. But I think this is one of the situations where we really need to reach out and get some international attention on the issues facing displaced and stateless persons with disabilities. And this can be something that using the CRPD or other mechanisms can do. Now, of course, this could help allocate some state resources more towards this area than they are being now, but it can also be a basis for reaching out and seeking international support where it's a country that has donors interested to fund projects and activities where we have clearly documented recommendations from some of these mechanisms identifying a need and a problem. That can also be a tool for reaching out to donors and finding funding and support to provide more services, both to nationals and to displaced and stateless people. So of course, there are always going to be limits of resources, but we can also try and creatively use some of these mechanisms to shine the light on particular gaps.
Thank you, Peter. And Juan Ignacio, would you like to add anything, please?
Thank you very much, Ricardo. It stems from Peter's reply also that the relevance of getting different recommendations coming from the state reviews helps to increase the leverage of the organizations advocating for that, even vis-a-vis international cooperation agencies and donors, which is already a lot. More in let's say human rights specific terms, to say it somehow, the opportunities before the different treaty bodies in the context of review of the implementation of the different conventions follow a calendar, and each of those treaty bodies has a list of countries coming soon, to say it like that. I added in the chat a link to that list that we, with our organizations, update frequently. And if you find any country of interest at any point of any procedure by any treaty body, then information can be prepared, shared, of course, focused on the scope of that treaty body, hoping to get recommendations from it as soon as possible to raise awareness of the issue, to increase leverage, and also to influence the work of United Nations country teams at the national level, and to influence and to be always present in the context of the work of the UN machinery, including, of course, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, for refugees. And then on a more specific approach, when it is about cases and the use of protocols, then it becomes a little bit more technical. So it's a little bit very much case-by-case basis, and exploring, of course, first, whether there are national opportunities to complain against the government or the administration at the national level, utilizing the typically the remedies that national law provides, and eventually once that exhausted with no result, go into the international arena. Of course, this implies lawyers and probably resources and so on and so forth. And eventually there could be exceptions that allow us to go more or less directly to the international arena, to the committees, and have a more quick reaction by those committees and eventually by the states in return. Very much on a case-by-case basis, of course. Sorry, I forgot to mention, also relying on the communication system of the special rapporteurs. But I insist on this point, quite case-by-case basis. Thank you very much, Ricardo.
Thank you. And I will go to a question related from Sylvester Katontoka, and it's as well having an operational aspect in Zambia. We have colleagues that are coming in the country as refugees, and mental health services are supposed to be made available to them as well. Any guidance on how we can reach them as OPDs? It is unclear if it's reach services or reach refugees and support them accessing mental health services. Maybe translating this into human rights mechanisms, is there any advice you could give on which would be relevant opportunities, as well articles under which these type of issues could be raised, and any other advice that you could share with Sylvester? Thank you. Who wants to go next? We can take turns. So Peter, would you like to go?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Ricardo, and thanks, Sylvester, for the question. Yes, in terms of the practicalities of working together with UNHCR in the field, I mean, I can't speak to Zambia because I don't know our operational footprint there, but I think in general, we encourage you to reach out to UNHCR as an OPD and see how we can collaborate, and that might include, sharing information or providing some ways of collaboration around specific individuals that are not having access to certain systems. When it comes to using the mechanisms, of course, as much as the laws are something that's looked at by the mechanisms, also they look at the implementation and practice. So we can raise issues where we don't have access, or organizations of persons with disabilities don't have access to individuals who are displaced or stateless and who may be in need of these services. So we can use the CRPD, but maybe even in this case, more effectively, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or some of those other more nimble mechanisms to highlight those cases, those individual cases where we think that persons with in need of mental health services, as you've suggested, are not receiving those services. So maybe that can highlight those cases, get some attention, and then maybe that will help facilitate access for UNHCR or for OPDs to access those populations. Just some first thoughts, but it's of course very case specific, so it's hard to know the specific challenges, but it's a good question and something I think you'll have to think through in each case.
Ignacio, would you like to add anything? Thank you, Peter.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Ricardo. Just to say, I took the question as the OPD wanting to contact and get in touch with those refugees with disabilities, I would assume. And here, I believe, beyond the fact of contacting actors on the ground and creating networks around the topic and be able to connect with the problem and the people, I believe that it's good to see that there is interest in national organizations of persons with disabilities to connect with issues on the rights of persons with disabilities, but who might not be at the very first moment their own constituency, right? Given that this is an issue, as I was mentioning in the initial presentation, that I can see perfectly throughout the many alternative reports, there are very few of those that tackle Article 18 of the CRPD, and when they do an Article 11, it's not necessarily around refugees, though of course there are exceptions, right? This is just a general impression. So in that sense, I believe it's great. And then of course, I go back to the end of my previous question and the one from Peter. Then what concrete actions or concrete steps to take we need to discuss based on the information and the things available at the national level first.
Thank you. And Ricardo speaking, I was checking while you were sharing the latest update from the operation and operational update about Zambia. And it is as well reflected that psychosocial disabilities and access to psychosocial services is highlighted as one of the gaps as well in the context, where there are more services for persons with physical disabilities. There were operational support for assistive devices and access to cash, training as well, so building capacities, but less capacity on mental health. So sometimes sharing these issues as well helps from a programmatic perspective to find areas for further work. And again, at an advocacy level, sharing as well with donors, member states who may be more interested in Article 32 and international cooperation to get as well to channel issues related to mental health, reminding as well that there has been an executive committee conclusion on mental health and refugees, and that mentions as well the importance of engagement of organizations of persons with disabilities, services for persons with disabilities. So using all these avenues is important. I will go, there was a question that was actually made in French by Emilio Neas, and it relates more to asylum procedures. I think I will read it in any case. I think it will be addressed in the webinar taking place on the 21st of November on asylum, refugee law and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But just in case you would like to add a quick note or to refer to any references or resources, the question reads, does an asylum seeker who is already in another country need to bring proof of his displacement from his country of origin? So I guess this is very much about asylum procedures, right? So I don't know if you think this is out of the scope of the discussion, or if there could be anything that could be helping. I have, for example, the importance of bringing disability certificates sometimes, right? Which is something that was highlighted in the Ukraine crisis. But is there anything you would like to highlight, and maybe starting now with Ignacio to give the floor then to Peter? Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. The only brief thing I can mention is that for sure we can find within the CRPD committee jurisprudence criteria requesting, first of all, that all those asylum seeking procedures are accessible and inclusive of persons with disabilities. And secondly, I would be, given the 2 or 3 cases that the CRPD committee dealt with that were about asylum seekers who, because of their disability, would have faced an irreparable harm when going back to the country that they were going deported to, I would assume that it's having a documentation that attests the different elements connected to disability can become a useful resource in the context of an asylum application if one would take into account the CPD committee jurisprudence in individual cases. Of course, at the national level, in the specific national context, there will be people probably checking the pros and cons of such an approach, depending on how refugee status is awarded in each context. I mean, in practice, beyond the text of the written laws. That would be my reaction to that, Ricardo. Thank you very much.
And Peter, would you like to add anything? Thank you.
Thanks. Just to add in general that, of course, however much information that an individual can collect and bring with them to document the situation, the basis by which they need asylum protection is, of course, helpful. But I think that asylum systems, if they're really fair and effective, they also have to accommodate the fact that people fleeing don't always have the ability to collect every possible document, and that they need to be able to assess some of these things even in the absence of documentation. So to the extent people can, without jeopardizing their safety, have access to documentation that can substantiate their case, all the better. But I think they also need to ensure that their cases can still be made in asylum systems where they might not have all of those, core documents. So just to say, yes, as long as it doesn't put the individuals, at risk of further harm or their families at harm by trying to access some of these documents.
Thank you, Peter. Very good point. We go to another question, and I think this was referring to one of the mentions made by Juan Ignacio on procedures, and I guess it is individual cases on what would happen in countries which didn't ratify the CRPD. Juan Ignacio.
Yes, thank you, Ricardo. So countries that did not ratify the UN CRPD, of course, are not reviewed by the CRPD committee. And if they did not ratify the convention, they, of course, did not ratify neither the optional protocol. So those cannot make use of the optional protocol. So the alternative that the international system would offer is either other treaty bodies, other committees which monitor conventions that the state did ratify. If the state, for instance, ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as an example. And then checking for each case whether or not the state also ratified an optional protocol if it was to submit an individual complaint. And if not, as I mentioned, maybe by the end of the presentation, the work of the special rapporteurs on the rights of persons with disabilities and the special rapporteur on internally displaced persons does not depend on the ratification of any treaty. So persons in a country that did not ratify the CPD could share the information on the violation of the rights as persons with disabilities to the special rapporteur on the rights of persons with disabilities, who, once decided to take the case, would communicate and express concerns to the government on that particular case or a group of cases if it is more than just an individual case. So that would be the complete reply to that question. Depending on the country, there can also be regional human rights systems like the Inter-American Commission and Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the Americas, like the African Court of Peoples and Human Rights and its commission. And of course, each of them have different similar but different kinds of requirements as well, but this would be something to explore as well for the specific country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Ignacio, for such a complete answer. Going to the next one, Peter, there was a question on having access to the questions about compliance to CRPD articles. Maybe if you could read some of the questions, at least for having an idea in terms of access, and we can share as well bilaterally the guidance, the guiding questions. Should I share my screen? So would that
I
help?
think that's okay, Ricardo. I have it here.
You have it. Okay.
But again, yes, just as an example, but we can share the broader series of questions that we have for you to consult afterwards. But on the screen, we had put Article 9, and a couple of suggested questions we'd had there were, do reception and detention facilities follow national standards on accessibility? So are the reception facilities for displaced people being treated in the same way as other types of reception facilities or detention facilities in the country? Are they receiving the same services there? Another question is information on refugee procedures and access to asylum systems available for persons with disabilities in an accessible way? So are people with disabilities who are entering these facilities and may be in need of international protection, are they receiving that information in a way that they can appreciate it and action it? Under Article 4 on equality and non-discrimination, just a couple of example questions we put there were, do the national asylum procedures ensure reasonable accommodations and adjustments to ensure non-discrimination? So as a person goes through the asylum system, are there reasonable accommodations to ensure that their case gets processed fairly and adequately, including, for example, provision of sign language interpretation if needed? Another question is, are refugees with disabilities protected under national legislation against discrimination on the basis of disability? And this kind of goes to that previous example I made, where are refugees being included as one of the populations that could be implicated by national legislation affecting persons with disabilities? So just a few guiding questions there as examples, but we're happy to share the broader list, also a non-exhaustive list, but just some ways that we're getting colleagues in the field to think more specifically about how these articles apply. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And I guess many of these questions won't be very alien or strange to colleagues working on organizations of persons with disabilities who are familiar with the convention. Is more applying them to situations experienced by refugees and contexts by refugees. And with this, I would encourage as well to use those opportunities to cross-fertilize, to collaborate. There is, for example, interesting operational responses that we've seen in Mexico, for example, where COAMEX, the National Organization of Persons with Disabilities, was supporting doing remote assessment of accessibility of reception facilities. And this is very innovative as a type of response, right? Saying, well, those are restricted areas. It's not really easy to get access to those facilities, but we could have remote access virtually and then share recommendations on how to improve accessibility in coordination with authorities. So that is also something that could be interesting. I'm going to go to the next one from Dula Surenjit, and is again around refugee and stateless situations and the link with human trafficking. So would be victims of human trafficking classified as refugees, or could be classified as refugees or stateless, as they often lose their identity documents due to the human trafficking and are unable to return home. Maybe this will be a question, I guess, more for the 21st for the grounds for asylum. But if you would like, starting with Peter and then Juan Ignacio, to share a couple of ideas, and in particular as well, how the context of engagement with human rights mechanisms could help in these type of issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thanks for the question. I think for victims of human trafficking, they can indeed be refugees or stateless persons. It really depends on the context. We find sometimes people who fall victims of trafficking are refugees just as a basis from persecution they would experience in their home country, or because of circumstances that happened in the course of being trafficked that makes them unable to return home. So there are definitely victims of human trafficking who could be refugees, who could be in need of international protection. And there may also be some who have fallen victim to trafficking who are stateless, who don't have a country of origin. Now, they wouldn't be necessarily a refugee or stateless simply because they don't have their identity documents and there's difficulties in returning them home. But of course, it is possible that some of them may qualify as refugees or stateless persons. I can put our guidelines on international protection, number 7, in the chat. That sets out a bit of more legal analysis of when a person who's been trafficked could be a refugee. But that would also apply as well to this intersection with also persons with disabilities who may have been trafficked, and links also with that example that Juan Ignacio shared earlier from the CRPD, where, for example, a person who may have been trafficked could then have refugee protection if they were returned to a country where they might not have adequate services or support that could amount to a type of persecution or other human rights abuse. So it would really be depending on the context, but it is possible, of course, that trafficked persons could be stateless or could be refugees as a result of their trafficking or simply separate from that.
Thank you, Peter. And Juan Ignacio, maybe for the interest of time, going to the last question, and I guess this is more of an advocacy-oriented question, right? On how, which strategies other countries use in order to ratify the CRPD, and clarifying that those countries who already ratified and signed the CRPD, I guess, here, and I understand would be maybe the optional protocol. So maybe this is more related to advocacy work, but if you would like to share any views on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Just to reply first with the information, around 185, if my memory serves me right, countries ratify the CRPD already. I don't know from which country the question is coming, but there are very few who did not, and around 100 countries ratified the optional protocol to the CRPD. So probably that's why we're not discussing any more strategies for ratification that open. Then, of course, it would very much depend on the national context into what would be the best strategy, depending on what is required by the Constitution to ratify or the national laws to ratify a convention. I can imagine a lot of lobbying to the executive power first, followed by lobby to parliamentarians to approve the decision, approve the treaty. But I mean, here we can foresee, of course, a lot of awareness raising and low political activities toward national legislators and national officials. I can share in the chat the link to the page with all the ratifications if I have 1 minute. Okay.
Thank you. And Peter, would you like to complete as well from UNHCR's perspective? Sometimes there's an advocacy as well for countries to sign other treaties, right?
Yes, and I think it kind of goes also to the issue of the complementarity between the human rights mechanisms, because quite often we're also advocating for ratification of different human rights treaties, whether it's the UNCRPD or otherwise through, for example, the Universal Periodic Review process, which is another UN mechanism, or through our engagement with the special rapporteur who may be going to that country. So we can also, although the core decisions have to be made by the parliament and the executive, and that's where the heavy lifting has to happen at the country level, we can also kind of reinforce that messaging with some of the other human rights mechanisms which do apply to a country to help advance that discussion.
Thank you, Peter. So we have addressed all the questions and we are at the end of the session. So I think it's a very good point. There is a last question, maybe how OPDs in Cameroon can be involved and it's a question for all of you. Maybe you could do a closing remark, right, on what are the opportunities to get involved in engagement with human rights mechanisms as closing remarks. Thank you.
I can begin if you like, Ricardo. So from the side of treaty bodies, I see that Cameroon is party to the Committee Against Torture, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention Against Racial Discrimination, the Committee on the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It's true that it has not ratified the CPD, but we had all those other opportunities at some point of time. And for colleagues of Cameroon and for colleagues of other countries, I would of course invite you all to check the calendar of upcoming reviews, and whenever you find your country or the country you want to report on, please do get in touch with us at International Disability Alliance, and we will be happy to support your participation, providing more detailed information as we have done in the PowerPoint, and trying to connect. Of course, this the work on this most of the times depends on your own working capacity as organizations at the national level, and eventually it can be combined with other opportunities for funding that might be available for the specific countries, which is not always the case, but luckily nowadays all this information is coming a little bit with more anticipation, so there's a chance to plan more in advance and seek for funding with information 1 year ahead of us. So that would be my invitation to put forward the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, forcibly displaced, and stateless persons with disabilities in the United Nations Treaty Body system. Thank you very much for the attention, and thank you, Ricardo, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Juan Ignacio. And Peter, if you want to share a word, I know that you have to leave.
Just to say thank you, and to emphasize that, we think of UNHCR also as a partner in the field. Of course, our operational priorities and the resources we have will vary, but do think of us as a partner. And I think this area of engagement with human rights mechanisms is one of those areas where we can have a lot of intersection and collaboration with organizations of persons with disabilities. So just leave it there. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a really interesting discussion, and pleased to be here with you all.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Juan Ignacio. And thanks to the International Disability Alliance for organizing the logistics, to Tanya, to all the interpreters. I always like to end in time just to acknowledge as well the work of all the interpreters that brought us together. Thanks, everyone. And there's links to the next webinars in the chat. I hope you have time to go to them and register. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.